This panel, it's exceptional. We begin a very important part of this conference about 1915, and the first speaker is Taner Akçam. I cannot give you all the bibliography, very long, especially this last year. We are in big concurrence, but for me, it's finished. It's impossible. Taner is professor in Clark University, and it's a prominent scholars. And please, it's 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Teşekkür ederim. Duyuyor musunuz?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank all those who are responsible for this perfect organization. And it is true that for me it is a great joy to be here. Of course, I have a bit of a jet lag, but that's normal. Now, my presentation is about assimilation. And Islamicization, of course, is one of the most important elements of this assimilation. It is a structural element, and it was applied from the beginning to the end, and it was an important part of genocide. Now, let me give you a theoretical framework first. Although it was a structural element of the Armenian genocide, systematically neglected. It was systematically neglected. You have here and there some articles on assimilation, but it was totally neglected as a field. There were two important reasons for this. The first one was that it was a normal result of accepting a legal definition as the basis of analyses in social science because it belonged to the sphere of the penal law. So, in fact, the 1948 definition pertains to this legal framework. And the second reason was that the sources used for the Armenian genocide had a specific character, and I'll be going into that. Now, as a legal term, when you use genocide, what kind of problem did this lead to? Lemkin, who in fact invented the concept, understood genocide not only as a single act, but alternatively as a series of connected acts, a process that unfolded over time. So generally speaking, Lemkin wrote in Axis Rule in Occupied Europe in 1944, he said, the work that introduced the concept genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation. So Lemkin sees the genocide as a process. And because of the 1948 definition, we tried to look at genocide as a single event. And so we had to look into different events as to whether they conformed or not to that definition. There might be a mistake here. The second important reason, according to Lemkin, is that there are two phases of genocide. First, the annihilation of the national characteristics. It can be physical or cultural. And as a second category, Lemkin says, there's the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor to the oppressed group. And one of the ways of doing this is assimilation, without doubt, and forcibly making people accept Islam. And when we did our genocide studies later on, we see that this aspect of assimilation was neglected. And as a result, in genocide studies, there was this negative outcome of looking at genocide only as a physical annihilation. And secondly, we kept looking at each event as to see whether it conformed to the 1948 definition or not. And the Holocaust was also a genocide, and it became a reference to see whether a certain event resembled the Holocaust or not, and if it didn't, it wasn't genocide. And I believe that social science methodologically went bankrupt as a result of this. It's like the bandit who cuts the road and he makes people lie down. If they have long feet, then they're cut off. If not, they're not. So it is the pro-Christian fable of Greek mythology. So this assimilation was cut off because it didn't fit the bed. There was no assimilation for Jews, so it didn't conform to the definition. But finally, since we took the Holocaust at the center of all our studies, and since we tried to have what the event that we were studying resemble that of the Holocaust, we didn't have an objective outcome. And we know that the first generation of Armenian scholars who did Armenian studies kept saying they insisted on the fact that it was so much like the Holocaust, but then they had to neglect other issues, forcible conversion, collecting children and putting them in orphanages. And we believe that there was a transitional settlement policy where Armenians were taken from one region and settled in another forcibly. Now, all of these were neglected because they didn't fit in. And then the sources we used. In the beginning, we used American, British, and German archives. And the memoirs of Armenian survivors from the genocide. So when you read these, it's not possible to have a full picture of what happened because there's a fluctuation throughout the process, and the consuls who wrote reports from the region do not go into the details since they couldn't know what was happening on a daily basis, so there's no systematic policy there. And even if they changed religion, they were killed off anyway afterwards. And in many cases, conversion was due to fanatic Muslims' oppression or the tolerance of administrators. Now, I claim that assimilation was an inseparable part of genocide from the very beginning, and I will try to show you how this was with a few documents. There are also documents about Armenians, which are where the two words temsil and temesül are used continually. So this is the word which was used not only for Armenians, but for all those who were not Turks or Muslims. And you also see the care and education of children come up very often. So if there is an assimilation policy of the Turkification of a group of Armenians, then this includes physical annihilation as well. How did they set up a balance then? The Ottoman rulers, in fact, had a demographic policy where they were applying the 5 or 10% population. So they thought that they could assimilate 5 or 10% of the Armenians. Let me give you an example. In Syria, in the places where the Armenians were settled, the Muslims were around 2 million. And the Armenians there was not to exceed the 10%. And indeed, you see that there is around 150,000 Armenians who were forcibly Islamicized in that region. So you see that there is a policy of demographically regulating the population. Now, the first acknowledgement of a conversion. You can find others in the archives, I'm sure, but this is the one I found. Now, there are two phases for me. One goes from May 1915 to 4 November 1915. During this period, you need to look at two different places. One, the assimilation policy in the places which were evacuated, and two, the places where they were settled, that is in Syria. So when they started evacuating the Armenians, they were allowed to change their religion, to convert. And this document that I found shows that these Armenians were able to stay where they were, and they were able to survive. They were not deported. But the condition was that they were to be dispersed into the different villages in the region where they already lived. From Ordu, Fatsa, Giresun, you see Armenians writing to the authorities, "We have become Muslims, we're not those terrorist Armenians, please don't send us so far away, we want to stay close to our families." We can see traces of this policy in their petitions. An important point here is that there are 3 documents that I saw about assimilation, and we see that all 3 of them are asked to be destroyed after being read. Now, that's very interesting. So you have 3 different documents sent at 3 different times, and all 3 have the mention of to be destroyed after reading. On the 1st of July 1915, conversion is prohibited, and up until then, those who have converted would be able to stay where they were, but dispersed over the region, so to survive. So after this date, all Armenians, even if they converted, were not allowed to. They write so many petitions, they plead with the authorities. Talat becomes angry and says, "Didn't I tell you not even a single one is to be accepted as a Muslim?" So after the 1st of July 1915, this policy ends. Why? Because the number was so high. And in fact, Talat himself says this in the telegrams. Their reason for converting is not because of their belief, but in order to survive. And even if they do convert, send them off. And so you have this prohibition from the 1st of July, and this is the period, July, August, September, where the bulk of the annihilation takes place. Now, you have another example, just to show you that it was not as a result of fanaticism. And the people in Urfa see the people who have been deported, and they want to migrate to Istanbul, and they say, "We'll turn our church into a mosque and we'll all become Muslims." And Talat says, "In no way can their church be turned into a mosque, and they will all be deported." This is a telegram where Talat gives this order. Now, this prohibition was done away with on the 4th of November 1915. And on that date, you see that in the whole of Anatolia and in the places of exile, Armenians are once again allowed to become Muslims because they can afford that. So in the telegram it is said they can stay where they are if they have not been deported. So if you send someone from one place to another, even though they've converted, and the convoy is at a certain place, when that decision was taken, they should stay where they were at that point in the deportation. So after the 4th of November 1915, they allow conversion once again, but there's a terrible policy of assimilation in Syria until the 4th of November. And in this policy, what we see is there's a certain settlement policy. They choose Aleppo as the center, and they disperse the Armenians from there. And the rule is they do not say anything about their religion. They say that the Catholicos would see Cemal Pasha, and there would be a priest appointed to each encampment. Up until 4th November, the policy was to allow for free religion, but not free language. They could not use Armenian. They could not have newspapers in Armenian. Armenian children could not go to Armenian schools. Everything had to be in Turkish and in public schools. And they had to have their houses in such places that defense would not be possible in those places. So in this very important policy, you see that the Armenians coming from the same region, let's say the first group of people from Zeytun who came to Halep, they dispersed them in Halep in the encampments so that they would not stay together, and then they began to assimilate them. And the last method was applied around 1916. I can't tell you the exact date. There are people working on that. So there was a turning point. And when did this come about? So the policy was either Islam or death. So up until November 1918, until they were allowed to become Christians again, all Armenians who had survived were Muslims. They had no other choice. And they were collectively Islamicized. And for me, the beginning is in November 1915, because the Armenian religious authorities were sent to an encampment in November 1915. And there you have the reports of the priests themselves. So they were not allowed to carry out the religious ceremonies. So during a whole period, a systematic policy was waged, and I claim this. And the main reason for this is to assimilate a certain group of Armenians within Ottoman society and to Turkify them. Let me finish off with an example to show you what happened to children. On 26 June 1915, there's a telegram. Diyarbakır, Adana, Halep, Trabzon, Erzurum, Sivas, Bitlis, it's sent everywhere. And there you have an expression. those people deported from their region, if they have children under the age of 10 years old, should be placed in orphanages and educated there. It has been planned to do this. Now, what is interesting here, at that time, from Diyarbakır, from Trabzon, from Sivas, from Bitlis, from Mamrat el-Aziz, there were no deportations. So this is information collected about children which were not yet deported and for whom information is collected. This is very important because they will become orphans, as it is said. And it is the Ministry of Education. It's not the Ministry of the Interior. They use the cipher of the Ministry of the Interior, and it is the Ministry of Education which sends out this decree. Secondly, on the 12th of July 1915, the deportation began, and in the first intensive days, please look at this expression, during the deportation of Armenians, there are children who will probably remain parentless, it is said. Who will probably remain parentless, it is said. And these children are gathered up, and I can give you two other facts about this. These children, when they were distributed into Muslim households, if that family did not have the financial means, the family received 30 kurush per child. If your financial situation was not welcoming. So all the inheritance rights of the children from their parents were left to the Turkish family who adopted them. Now, of course, we can debate why they were orphaned, but don't remember that this was an encouragement measure at the time. You have a monthly payment, and you have the inheritance rights of the Armenian parents of the children, which is given to the adopting family. And families fight with one another to get those children because the family was rich, and they were going to appropriate all those riches. So my last word would be that when we speak of assimilation, this was systematically practiced throughout the genocide, and the religion of the Armenian children was forcibly changed. They were forcibly gathered up and distributed to Turkish families' homes where Armenians did not exist. And so this all shows that assimilation was an inseparable part of the Armenian genocide from the very onset. And this is why you have so many Armenians who are now Muslims. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Taner, for this concrete presentation. The second speaker is Armen Marsoobian. It's a philosopher. It's professor of philosophy in Southern Connecticut State University. His last work is an exhibition about Marsovan. I think that is autobiographical. I don't know. It's your family?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And you speak about your personal family experience, please.
Thank you. And thank the organizers of this conference. As a child growing up in New York City, the little that I knew about the events of 1915 primarily came from two sources: my parents, who were genocide survivors, and my Armenian American friends. What I knew was simple enough. An ancient 2,000-year-old nation had been cleansed from its historic homeland in present-day Turkey. The few survivors were scattered across the globe in what we now know or call the Armenian Diaspora. Everything was black and white. The Turks were the perpetrators and the Armenians the victims. My parents were very young when the genocide began, and they survived due to luck and circumstance. These stories of survival seem simple enough. I did not probe my parents further about what now seem to be anomalies from a familiar pattern of survival stories. The familiar pattern I'm talking about is the one that claims that all Armenians were rounded up in towns and villages, put on deportation caravans, and massacred en route or died from the rigors of their march into the Syrian desert. The few survivors either settled in the Middle East or emigrated to nations around the world. Yet my parents' story varied from this pattern. My mother's father, a professional photographer, was spared from deportation because the Ottoman army and the local government needed his skills. He was able to save his immediate family in the town of Marsovan or Marsovan. If you, whoops, yep. After the First World War, my family attempted to restart their lives in their hometown, but were eventually forced to leave due to the rise of Mustafa Kemal's nationalists. First Greece and then the United States became their home. Yes. I'm just going to keep speaking, and it's not working. Okay. No. No, it won't go. Sorry. There's a beautiful picture of Marsovan, but it won't work. Okay. My father's story had an element that I found odd at the time, but did not question. My grandfather had emigrated to the United States before the war, but his wife and children were left behind in their village near Palu. The family survived the initial deportations due to the protection offered them by an Islamized uncle married to a Kurdish woman who was living in a remote mountain location. This Islamized relative had converted many years earlier in order to gain release from the Sultan's prison. Eventually, my grandmother and my father reached Aleppo, while two of his siblings perished on the journey. As with my mother's family, my father would eventually settle in America, where he met my mother and married. Who was this Islamized Armenian relative? A man who played a crucial role in saving my father from certain death, yet a man never named and little mentioned again in the family lore. I had always been taught that Christianity lay at the core of Armenian identity, an identity forged in 301 AD when the nation had converted to Islam. Christianity was central to Armenian survival over the course of nearly 2 millennia of domination by other peoples and empires. While I know very little about the role this Islamized relative played in my father's story, I know much more about the role of Islam in my mother's story of survival. I suspect, strangely enough, that I know much more than my mother herself ever knew. And this is the story I will tell you today. I begin with a photograph, one I first saw many years ago when I was casually browsing through an old family photograph album. It was a strange photo of people I did not recognize. Years later, this photograph and the glass negative from which it derives, along with hundreds of others, came into my possession. Having learned from my mother the rough outlines of our family survival story, I had by then some appreciation of the context of many of these inherited photographs. Yet many details were missing. My mother, born in 1911, was quite young at the time. Much of what she knew she learned from her parents and older brothers. Yet years later, after my mother passed away, I learned that she did not know many elements of their survival story and was probably intentionally kept in the dark about them. I learned of these beginning in 2009, 3 years ago, when I started delving into the large written record left by my surviving relatives. I will only be able to tell you a very small portion of this story using this photograph. And the sources I use are my grandfather's memoir, my great-uncle Aram's memoir, and most importantly, the memoir of the niece of my grandfather, Akçam. My grandfather was a photographer with his brother Aram in the cities of Marsovan, Samsun, Konya, Amasya, and Adana. For it was here that I came upon a startling discovery, an account of my family's conversion to Islam and the adoption of Turkish identities. I was shocked. I was completely ignorant of this event. While my mother was too young to recall this event, her older brothers were certainly old enough to remember. One can only speculate as to why they chose to keep it a secret even from their own sister. No one in my generation knew this secret. I had in front of me a richly detailed day-by-day account of the events leading up to the August 10th, 1915 conversion. Needless to say, this was not a voluntary conversion, for it was done under the coercive pressure of violent deportation. From missionary accounts, I learned that the date of August 10th, 1915 coincided with the tragic date of Anatolia College's history. This is the American college in Marsovan, the college for which my grandfather worked as a photographer. On this date, the Armenian professors, staff, and students and their families who had sought sanctuary on the campus were forced onto the deportation marches that led to their death. The months preceding this fateful day in August were marked with escalating fear and violence, the direct result of which was a mass conversion of Armenians to Islam. Combining a variety of sources, I've reconstructed an almost day-by-day account of these horrific spring and summer months of 1915. Again, given the brief time we have, I can't give you all those details. A book will be coming out both in Turkish and English that tells the full story. The first stage of this genocidal process in Marsovan began on April 29th, 1915. The political leaders of the Armenian community were arrested and soon sent off to Sivas for execution. On June 2nd, orders were given that all firearms and army deserters be turned over to the government. Many complied after the urging of their religious leaders, yet on June 26th, upwards of 1,200 males between the ages of 20 and 45 were arrested and jailed. Among the detainees was Garabet Kırımcan, whose personal and financial relationships with local government officials proved crucial in the negotiations regarding the fate of the prisoners. Kırımcan first persuaded the prisoners to turn in whatever weapons they still possessed, but soon noticed that small groups of chained prisoners were being marched off in the middle of the night. Having inquired with the gendarme's commandant, Mahir Bey, he discovered that these men were being deported to Aleppo. Kırımcan eventually persuaded Mahir Bey to accept a fee of 50 Turkish lira per person to allow anyone who so desired to convert to Islam and thus escape deportation. First-hand reports of the cruelties witnessed in the barracks are also contained in the family memoirs. The first mass conversions in Marsovan took place at the end of June and the beginning of July. Ironically, Interior Minister Talat Pasha had just ordered a halt to most conversions when he realized that too many Armenians were willing to convert in order to escape death, undermining the CUP's policy to reduce the Armenians to under 10% of each Sanjak's population. The official deportation orders in Marsovan were announced on July 4th. While the numbers of converts may be somewhat exaggerated, Kırımcan concludes that about 3,000 persons, and I'm quoting here, wives, old ones, children were converted. Kırımcan then reports that the 10% rule was implemented and only 1,200 who had already paid the bribe could stay, while the remaining 1,800 converts were deported. He also reports that a significant proportion of the Protestant Armenians converted, while the Catholic and Orthodox refused to do so. By August, the only non-converted Armenians remaining in Marsovan were those on the Anatolia College campus and the surrounding neighborhood, including my family, the Dildilians, and the Der Haratunyans. The leaders of Anatolia College had successfully bribed local officials to protect their Armenian staff and families. All this hard work came to naught when the gendarmes finally entered the campus and deported the Armenians on August 10th. My great-grandfather Tsolog was warned by Mahir Bey that the protection he was afforded could no longer continue without conversion, so with the encouragement of Kerimidjan, the family converted on the afternoon of August 10th. The stage is now set to return to this puzzling photograph. There's much more about what happened on August 10th, but can't tell you that. Now let me ask some simple questions. When was this photograph taken? Where was it taken? Who is in the photograph? What are these people doing? And what is the message these individuals are trying to convey in this photograph? The final question, and the most important for the purposes of this talk, is how did these individuals come to be in this particular place at this particular time for this photograph to be taken? The answer to the first question, when was it taken, is established by the banner. This is just a list of all the converted Armenians that remained, and you can see the name, the photographer's name there, and the Turkish names given to these individuals. And that's just the house where the photograph was taken. And this is just a map showing where the house is compared to my grandfather's house. But let me get back to the photograph. Okay. That banner hanging on the back says Jesus Zanov 1916, which translates to Jesus was born 1916. The individuals are celebrating Christmas, in this particular case, Armenian Apostolic Christmas, which is traditionally celebrated on January 6th. We know from accounts in Martha's memoirs that her mother, Haigunush, pictured in the photograph leaning her head on her left arm, was a devout apostolic, unlike her older brother Tsolog, who had adopted the Protestant faith. The memoirs mention that the first Christmas after the deportations was secretly celebrated in the Der Haratunyan household, answering our second question as to where the photograph was taken, and that was the picture I show here of where the house was. The Der Haratunyan house in Marsovan is at the edge of the city, and this is a photograph showing it. Answering the third question, who is in the photograph, takes us directly to the topic of the individuals rescued by my family. The 5 young males in this photograph are relatively young men who would have been of draft age. Young males were called up for service prior to the deportations. Conversion to Islam may have enabled them to avoid the deportation, but did not exempt them from conscription. Aram Dildilim, pictured in the back row on the right, had been allowed to convert to Islam and given the Turkish name Zeki. As a youth, he had a leg amputated, exempting him from military service. The 4 young men pictured would be considered deserters at this point in January 1916 and would have been subject to arrest and immediate execution. Almost all Armenians serving in the Ottoman army had been disarmed and placed into labor battalions after Enver Pasha's order of February 25, 1915, and by spring many of these soldiers were being slaughtered en masse. These 4 young men had been hidden in Haigunush's house since August 10, 1915. Through various sources, we have been able to identify the 4, and I have the names here: Khachador, Haig, Garabed, and Lemuel. Lemuel Sharinian were all students at the college, except for Garabed, who was an instructor in the carpentry shop. Now, this is a picture of Lemuel in his happier days, and this is a picture of Aram with Haig and Lemuel. The next question that we ask, what are these people doing, has already been partially answered, celebrating Christmas. In addition and if we look at a close-up of the picture, in addition to the Bible and the cross that HaYDer is holding, are a number of objects that would be used in the Mass, including bread and a glass of what appears to be water, but it could be wine, but wine was scarce at this time, a candlestick with a candle missing, and an incense holder with no incense in it. Could the missing wine, candle, and possibly incense reflect the reality of the deprivations, yet still symbolize their faith in persevering? Maybe. The family is documenting this Christmas celebration for posterity and simultaneously affirming their true faith despite having outwardly adopted their oppressor's faith. There may also be a political message here. The flag on the table has 3 horizontal stripes and 2 oblique bands with 3 stars in each. This resembles the flag of the Society of Armenian Students of Geneva. Geneva was the center of the diaspora and Armenian nationalist activity in the 1890s, and this is where the Hunchags and Dashnags were formed. We now come to the final question regarding this old photograph and the topic of the survival of the Armenians in Marsovan. How did these individuals come to be in this particular place at this particular time? I now realize that this story cannot be told in 20 minutes, so I won't be able to tell it. But let me just try to quickly go through this. Neighborhood by neighborhood, the deportations had continued from late June till July. At first, Haganush, my great aunt, expanded the family hiding place, but after seeing her neighbors violently forced out of their houses, she decides in July to move into her brother's house across the street from the college. Her brother Çolag has been exempted from the deportations by Mahir Bey. Çolag had close ties to the college. His brothers and children were students there. He was the college photographer, operated the hospital's x-ray machine, and ran the stationery store. As the deportations continued into July, the Armenian male students gradually became aware that the college could no longer protect them. 3 of them, Hovanes, Hagop, and Garabed, close friends of Çolag's younger brother Armen, agree that when the time came for the deportation, they would escape to a remote nearby mountain location. Their plan was to live off the land and rough it through the autumn and winter, hoping that by spring the Ottoman armies would be defeated on the Russian front. Earlier, they had buried rifles and ammunitions and hatchets in hiding places on the campus and obtained a promise from Aram that once the campus had been cleared, he would return, get the rifles, get the hatchets, bring it to my grandfather's house, and they would attempt to break away from the deportation caravan and come and collect their supplies. That fateful day of deportation, August 10th, is depicted in the Memoirs. They provide an account of what happened on the campus. On that day, the family gathered on the roof of my grandfather's house and watched as the oxen carts took the young students from the campus. This is on the right-hand side is my grandfather's house. There's another picture of it. Aram comments, quote, "It was a tragic scene for us to watch. One by one, all the oxen carts came out of the main gate where the soldiers with bayonets on both sides watched them closely. All our dear and able professors, teachers, and their wives and children, all our college students and other workers, with tearful eyes, we watched them go one by one, our last hope for survival of our nation's cream." This theme of the survival of the nation's cream clearly motivates Aram and his family to rescue the few Armenians who managed to escape. These educated young men and women, hidden by the family for upwards of 3 years, provide the hope for the nation that will be reborn once the war ends. These are just oxen carts here. The memoirs describe how these young college men escaped from the deportation when it paused at a monastery just outside of town. Aram had kept his promise, and with the aid of my grandfather and grandmother, the men set off. And this is just a picture of my visiting where the monastery is and standing under the tree that's described in the memoir. Just summarizing again, it becomes too difficult for these young men in the mountains. They come back to Marsovan, and they are hidden in the family home. But let me just read you one description of what happens at this monastery. This is the remains of the monastery today. And this is written by Malatya. Garo and his companions then go and hide amidst the wheat stalks. Some moments later, the transportation caravan sets out, and when his mother and sister walk past, Garo wants to rush forward, but his companions hold him back because their hiding place would have been revealed. And anyway, what help would it have been to his mother and sister? He would have been executed before the caravan reached the field of irises. This was the last time that Garabet saw his family. No one knows where or when they perished. And I will skip ahead here. As the count goes on, more and more young men are found hiding in the abandoned Armenian homes, and they're taken into the family hiding place. And there's a description of the building and expanding of the hiding place. They do this building at night, and they raise the walls of the compound at night so that the next day the walls are higher and higher. And they have hiding places that are fake hiding places, so if the police come and see what is a hiding place and seeing it empty, they would leave the family alone. I have 1 minute, so I will skip ahead and just summarize. So by a certain point in 1917, they have 10 young men and a complication of 8 young women who were brought here into the house because they want to avoid being assimilated or married off to Turkish families in the town. And these are 8 young women from the college. The combination of the 18 men and women complicates the living arrangements, and an even more elaborate hiding place is produced. At the same time that this is happening in Hayganush's house, in my grandfather's house, hiding places are being created. And between the two families, two houses, somewhere in the neighborhood of 28 people are hidden for upwards of 2 to 3 years. By 1917, things loosen up, so some of these individuals can go off. So let me then just conclude, and that ultimately is how all these young men wind up, these 4 original young men wind up in that Christmas photograph. And I would like to conclude my story, not with words, but with an image. The heroes of this story are Çolag, Armen, Aram, and Hayganush. These 3 siblings who risked, okay, sorry. Right, okay. These heroes of this story are Çolag, Aram, and Hayganush, 3 siblings who risked their lives to save their fellow human beings, and whose heroism has never fully been recognized. Thank you.
Thank you, Armen. Well, the next speaker is Anna Aleksanyan from Armenian Genocide Museum and Institute of Yerevan. It's you finish field doctora. You are a field doctor. Yeah. Okay. And you speak about Ruben Heryan. Okay, please, 20 minutes.
Thank you, Professor. Ruben Heryan, liberator of Armenian women and children from Muslim families after the Armenian genocide. At the end of the First World War, many Armenian and international organizations, foreign missionaries as well as individuals, focused on helping the genocide survivors, trying to find those who were alive, save them from slavery, and to restore their Armenian identity. My report is about the importance of the liberation mission after World War I, and will mainly concentrate on the activity and life of Ruben Heryan, who was one of the prominent activists and the liberator of Armenian women and orphan children of the genocide. He was born in 1869 in Tokat, Yevdokia. In 1883, after graduating from the National Seminary of Tokat, he moved to Constantinople and then New York, where he started to run his own business. While living in Constantinople, Ruben Heryan was Hınçak, Social Democratic Hınçakian Party, and then became the member of the Armenian Democratic Liberal Party. In New York, he supported the same party and was engaged in solving the national issues. In America, he was one of the founders of Gırtasirac Virtun. In 1914, when First World War began, Heryan was already accomplished enough in his business and enjoyed a good reputation with the American Armenians. Soon after learning about the Armenian genocide, he left everything there and together with the Armenian volunteers moved to Near East, where he joined the Armenian Legion. In summer of 1918, when the volunteers of the Armenian Legion were part by part transferred to the war front of Palestine, Heryan was not sent because of his age. He was appointed to a watcher of a hospital near Cairo. Although Heryan took care of the wounded Armenian volunteers and French soldiers, however, it's obviously seen from his letters that he wished to be younger to join the other legionnaires in support of the salvation of his people and the homeland. And this was the main reason for him to become one of the most dedicated figures who took any little opportunity of the ceasefire to set Armenian women and children free from Muslim slavery. Very often, the Armenian and international organizations had many issues between each other because of the political reasons, but mainly each of them tried to find solutions supporting various parties who, in their turns, did not go hand by hand. Nevertheless, Heryan was one of the unique figures within all this political turmoil who work with almost all the activities regardless of any political issues, aiming to reach his major goal to liberate. The result was the most important for him. To achieve his goal, Heryan collaborated with the English and French superior military authorities, AGBU, Armenian General Benevolent Union, Armenian National Communion, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, the representatives of League of Nations, the nearest relief activities, and etc. The main source of this research is the personal archive of the great liberator in the National Archives of the Republic of Armenia. There are hundreds of letters, petitions, official letters, documents, lists of rescued and searched orphans. Their photos illustrated the whole history of his hard and complicated activity. During his mission, Heryan did not have a permanent address. He informed about his place either through daily papers or relatives. A great number of the archival documents are the petition letters that have one basic content: to find and save, to liberate these relatives or the next mother, daughter, sister, son, and so forth. The petition letters are written in dialects of regions of the Western Armenia. Sometimes the letters are Turkish in Armenian characters, sometimes in Arabic. The letters are often small pieces of papers or cards, or which the notorious destinies of the Armenian survivors of the genocide are scratched with pencil. The rescue of the Islamized Armenian from the Muslim institutions was known as the Mission of Salvation or Liberation Mission. It was not easy to save an Armenian who was adopted by foreigners, married, or converted its religion. Sometimes their patrons did not have any will to send them back, hiding their identity and existence, crossing their tracks within the Mesopotamian tribes, moving them from one place to another. Having pieces information, sometimes it could take months and years in search of an Armenian, but often without any result. It should be mentioned that the Treaty of Sevres incorporated an article dealing with issue of liberation. Article 142 recognized that under the terrorism regime in Turkey since November 1st, 1914, Fazid conversions to Islam were widespread tactics during the period 1914-1918, and recurred to empire to cooperate with the mixed commissions appointed by the League of Nations to search and liberate those people in order to repair so far as possible the wrongs inflicted on individuals in the course of the massacres perpetrated in Turkey during the war. The Armenian Liberation and Rescue Groups was formed in spring of 1918, headed by Egyptian Armenians. The first group, which had called Armenian Expeditionary Rescue Group, led by Levon Yotnekhparyan, a soldier who had served in the 4th Ottoman Army in Damascus, benefited from the support of famous Arab leader Emir Faisal, who struggled for liberation of Syria from Turks, and the British General Staff. The group succeeded in pursuing its operations after the armistice in Havran region and transferring the rescued Armenians to Dera or Damascus. When the young Turk leaders escaped from Turkey on November 1st, 1918, it gave a new start to rescue actions. In November 1918, the members of Egyptian Armenian National Relief Committee of AGBU, Armenian National Union, and Armenian Orphan Caring Union formed a special committee. On 30 November, one of the organizers of the committee, Bishop Torgon, sent an instruction program to the members of this newly created body, which became cornerstone for their activity. Ruben Heryan was one of the members of this group. One of the samples of the instruction program held in Heryan's personal archive and consists of 15 points. The third and 8 points particularly deal with liberation movement. The overall idea of this instruction was the following: all Armenians who replace names and forcefully converted to Islam must be liberated and sent back, and if they are abducted by Muslim, everything should be done to save them. Then in February 1919, the ethnic conflict in Aleppo, resulting in the death of hundreds of Armenians, complicated the mission of the activities. The British authorities feared to raise the Islamic authorities of Syria against them and wanted to avoid troubles. That's why the threat to postpone liberation mission. In his letters, Heryan mentioned the policy pursued by the English authorities. Nevertheless, realizing the seriousness and importance of the situation, he made any effort to preserve good relations with them. In any case, he did not stop to carry on the liberation mission. After the French authorities assumed the Syrian mandate, Heryan was provided with large opportunity to carry on his mission. Heryan was about 15 when he came to Middle East to join the activity of salvation on his people. He had a nickname, a young man with gray hairs, because of his gray hairs and as well as for his practical and cheerful character. During several months, he became the spare of the Armenian orphans, the Liberator, the Savoir. In 1919, AGBU established a fund of the liberation in order to carry out the vital project of the liberation of orphans who are lost or captured in the dead of the desert, and at the same time to save the Armenian young girls from harems. In April 1919, Heryan was given a task to search the Armenian women and children in Aleppo and Derzor and their surroundings. Heryan singled out from other liberators, mainly for carrying out his mission, particularly in Derzor, and as Ruben Heryan called it, the city of crime. It is particularly interesting to read his letter on 19 July 1919 from Derzor, addressed to Ruben's relatives and good friend Metax. The letters indicate the problems he faced while moving first caravan of 320 people to Aleppo, then after by help of Kelex, moving 350 orphans to Baghdad, planning to go back to villages, taking the orphans back with him, as well as buying many Armenian women and searching the abducted people, most importantly because of the Arabs had to overcome the problem of convincing the survived Armenian to bring them back. Also, he tells about the main financial problem he had. He wished to have much money to buy many more Armenians from Kurds, Turks, Arabs, and so forth. As well as he writes about his own savings he had that were spent for the same mission, staying with no money in his pocket. Here is his thought about himself. My heart bleeds when I think I can financially break down, I can grow old and cannot achieve my goal. There will be many money, but there will be no people as well. In the same letter, he tells about those national activities for whom the liberation of the orphans and women is not some major issue. Therefore, they are busy with other works. Even the members of the Armenian national delegation who participate in the conference on peace in Paris, he called the patriots of the world. According to Heryan, the major matter was the very mission of liberation at that moment. Whether I'm stupid or the patriots of the world are clever, but I cannot work against my own principles. The orphans are the hearts of Armenia. To liberate one more Armenian is for our benefit. They are the parts of my heart. When wandering through the desert there in the sun, the white sparkling skulls and bones are crying out loud, set our orphans free, and who can be indifferent seeing all this? After all, I must work until I die. The cooperation of Heryan with the most remarkable activist of Liberator mission, Misak Melkonyan, the adopted son of Karen Yepe, the representative of League of Nations in the Near East, was of utmost importance. Misak had both Armenian and Arab partners, which greatly facilitated the rescue operations. He formed a group of horsemen who, under his command, sought and liberate the Armenian orphans and women in desert from the tents of the Bedouins. Sometimes these groups crossed over the border to Turkish side and set free the women and children abducted by Turks and Kurds. The survived people were stated in Aleppo in the garden called Sheir Daha, located in the northern part of the city on the bank of Quick River. The place, which is now one of the most Singleton suburb, was rather far away from the city. The tents were shelter for the orphans, boys and girls, refugees and widows fled from Turkey or escaped from the Bedouins. All the survived people were provided with the necessary food, health care, clothes. Their identities were checked and a list of their names were sent to the newspapers, churches and Armenian communities in order to their relatives to find them. These were many people from the city who came to find their siblings within the newscom of the collect some data about the destiny of their relatives. Ruben Heryan participated not only in the liberation of women and children, but also in the process of their settlement and rehabilitation. The many years of abduction, physical and sexual abuse, and caused a lot of physical and psychological problems to those women. They needed to be carried and cared for returning back to the society. One of the first organizers cooperating with Heryan to this end was Halepi Hayat Mutun, the Union of the Armenian Women of Aleppo. This organization established a shelter for the abused Armenian women liberated from Muslim institutions. One of the most complicated issue of that period was the fate of the orphans and women who refused to recognize their Armenian identity for one reason or another. Most of them had been turned from their Armenian roots at a very young age, forget their mother language and nationality. But there were Armenians who, although remember but did not recognize their Armenian origin for different reasons. The women were in much more complicated situation. Typically, to a psychologist, Heryan was treating each orphan and woman with a special care. Sometimes he succeeded in his work, sometimes he failed, but never give to any disappointment. It must be mentioned as well that within his archive there are a number of letters addressed to him, which is micro-stories in their context where some episodes of the Armenian genocide are described. The letters are like a huge puzzle containing the fragments of those lives and conditions during and after the genocide who must have been saved by Heryan. At the same time, they also deliver any details such as locations, names, physical descriptions of their relatives or siblings or parents, sons and daughters abducted, abused, raped, humiliated, slaughtered by Turks, Kurds, Arabs, for Heryan to find them. In October 1919, he left to Constantinople and returned to Adana to raise money. Ruben took the money raised by his friends and went back to Derzor to continue the vital mission of his desert. In this period, there was a truce in the desert and rebellion was raised within the Arabs. He could hardly save his life from obvious death. From his letters, it is clearly seen that in 1920, while the Armenian organizations and benevolent unions raised money for already liberated and saved Armenian orphans and women, Heryan never stopped to raise money for liberation mission, first in Europe, then in America. When he returned from America, he intended to marry an Armenian orphan and to settle down in Mersin, Cilicia. But unfortunately, on 7 July 1921 in Cairo, he passed away from heart attack several days before his wedding ceremony. The liberation mission of thousands of Armenian women and children abducted by Islamic forces as a result of the Armenian genocide was one of the most important problems in the post-genocide period that required as urgent solution. This mission included not only social organizations but also private Armenians and sponsors who did everything in their power to carry out this important mission to liberate the abducted Armenians. One of the devoted figures of this mission was an American businessman, a volunteer of the Armenian Legion, Ruben Heryan, who put all his life and property into rescue operation, collaborating with the most different organizations and activities, and devoted himself to this work until his death in 1921. Unfortunately, he passed away very early, and those who continue his work didn't succeed in liberating all the Armenians. Thank you.
And now, the next and last speaker is Gayane Çobanyan. It's lecturer in Yerevan State University, yes, and he prepared a field doctorate about political Islam in Azerbaijan. Please, 20 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to be talking about Arabized Armenians, but I'm going to be speaking in my own native tongue. Recently, there is something that is very topical. That's Islamized Armenians. Usually, when this is discussed, one talks about Turkicized and Islamized Armenians, but we should also be speaking about Arabized Armenians. There are very few written sources on this, but in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Jordan, and even in Turkey, there are groups of Armenians that have been Arabized. This is undeniable. In this short period of time allotted to me, I'm going to be presenting to you, I will try to present to you a general picture of this phenomenon. This research was based on certain sources. First of all, on the basis of the memoirs of the survivors of the genocide. This is important from the following point of view. As generations change, the valuable information provided by them is forgotten more and more and tends to get lost, to disappear, to vanish totally. Now, in Asia Minor and the Armenian highlands, the Turkish invaders, in order to assimilate the Christian peoples of these territories, had to impose Islam. There were many different methods in making, in forcing them to convert into Islam. Techniques of taxation, techniques of threats, and even under the threat of death. The Armenians, as one of the peoples of the Ottoman Empire, which are non-Muslims, were also subjected to these kinds of pressure. The most important massacres here, with this envisaging the assimilation of Armenians, is the Hamidian massacres. Certain Armenian groups, in order to survive these massacres, had to accept Islam, to convert to Islam. Then some went back to their own religion, but others continued as their lives as Muslims. If one considers Turkicization or Kurdification as equivalent to Islamization, then of course here there is a kind of equivalence between religious and national assimilation. Of course, in these regions, Arabs also lived. They had really lost their national identities, but there are Arabized Armenians in Lebanon where they have kept their Christian identity. In the Lebanese press, there are signatures which show the Armenian origin of these people. Then we can remember the people of Laskia who are Arabized Armenians. Their Armenian identity is lost. In the northeast of Syria, there are 4 Arab Ashirets, tribes, which are of Armenian origin. They do have a consciousness of their Armenian identity. The Syrian ethnographist, ethnologist Hagop Çobanyan researched into these. Then there are 4 groups. First, there are the Arabized, Islamized Armenians. They have totally lost their Armenian identity, but still conserve certain Armenian words in their Arabic. Then there is a second group which are Arabized, but are affiliate to the Orthodox Greek Orthodox Church. Then there are Arabized Armenians who speak Arabic but have an identity of the Armenians. Then there are those Arabs who are affiliated to the Armenian Church directly. So there are very great difficulties here. The Arabized Armenians, which is a general concept, really covers different categories and sometimes contradictory categories, subcategories. And let's talk about Arabized and Islamized Armenians. Over time, we can divide into 2 groups, the Islamized and Arabized Armenians. From Samsun, Antep, Zeytun, Marash, Kilis, these groups came. They came from the Kilikia region hundreds of years ago, and over time they lost their Armenian identity and became Arabized. They're called Al-Arman al-Qodama, meaning ancient Armenians. They're the Pakara here. This is a Nashiret that distinguishes itself. They see themselves as the continuation of the Pakradunik kingdom. The Pakraduns have an oral tradition transmitted from generation to generation. They came to Arabia in the times of the Pakradunian kingdom and are continuing the tradition. They have around a population of around 100,000. Jebel Abdulaziz, Hasekia, Muhafaza-Nay are the regions where they are very populous. I'm not mentioning all the cities. There are also cities in Iraq where they live, and also Lebanon, even Egypt. There are Pakarans who speak Turkish in Turkey, in the Urfa and the Diyarbakir regions. According to their population, according to Abdülkerim İsa Süleymani, they're around 90,000 in population. During those who were saved from exile were protected by these groups. Well, from deportation, apparently. There's a second group then. In the ongoing genocidal policy of the Ottoman Empire, in the decimation of the Armenian population, tens of thousands of women and children survived. And they died on the route of deportation. But many were abducted by Ottoman gendarmes or Kurdish Agas and the local Badawi tribes. In certain situations, Arab officials, on the basis of instructions they received from the Ottoman Central State, destroyed the Armenian deportees that came to their regions. Some stood up against this. For instance, the officials of Deir ez-Zor and Hama in Syria. And in the El-Bashir region of Diyarbakir, the district governor acted in the same manner. In Mosul and in other Arab regions, this is how certain officials acted. In certain regions, peoples who were under the pressure of the Ottomans share the same fate. Here, certain Arab peoples who were more developed than the Turkish nation really set the tone. That is to say, the Young Turk government, in the years of the First World War, followed policies that would destroy the Arabs as well as the Armenians. There are some historians that defend this point of view very forcefully. But it is difficult to generalize from certain regions as regarding the opening up of living space for Armenians by the Arabs. But there have been many spaces where orphans were given as sanctuaries by the Arabs. And this is recorded in the registers of the Armenian Patriarchate. In certain ashirets, tribes, there were at least 500 Armenian orphans. In the Zigur Ashiret, 600, and in another tribe, 700 orphans. And many Armenian organizations and international missionary groups helped save the lives of women and children. Garen Yepyan worked together with Arab tribes, Ashirets, and found 2,000 Armenian women and children. But it was not possible to save all the Armenian children. There were so many obstacles. Women who had children from Muslim Arabs did not disclose their identities for fear of death. They adopted the Arab way of life and abandoned their own identity. The number of Arabized women can therefore not be established. But there was then another factor. Some Armenian women got married to certain Arabs legally, so they had tattoos made in certain parts of the faces or bodies, and that way it could be discovered that these were Armenian women, but these were also signs of the past shame. This way, their existence was legalized. There were of course, groups that had converted en masse to Islam in order to save to protect their rights and not to be assimilated among other groups. They developed certain tactics. A similar example is the Arabized or the Kurdified Armenians in the Jazia region between Iran and Turkey. They formed their own ashirats so as not to be assimilated into other groups, and irrespective of their religious or linguistic differences, they've presented themselves as an Armenian ashirat. Kévorkian explained this for us. Ashirat Arman al-Shatat is the name of this tribe. This Armenian tribe was established on the 2nd of February 1988 in Rasulayn, in Amuda, in Zargan. They have their own representations, and all the data were recorded, the elderly of the families, the number of the members of the families, and the number of the members of this ashirat reaches up to 25,000. Some speak Arabic, many speak Kurdish, some speak Arabic. The Syrian government is helpful in the organizing of this ashirat because it sees a kind of balancing factor here as opposed to the separatists or the subversives. After 1915, in the Kilis, Çomaklu, Jibin, and Peyran villages of Western Armenia, many Armenian women and children who had emigrated from these areas took exile in Jordan and were Arabized. These are in a process of disappearance. Now, I would like to speak about certain Arabized Armenians in Turkey. According to researchers, there are Armenians that are Arabized and Islamized in certain regions of Turkey, such as Adana, Antep, and Urfa. These are used by Turkish historians who wish to deny the genocide. Yusuf Alacoğlu, for instance, has certain documents which shows that there are converted Armenians dating back to the years 1936-37, 1.5 million. This is an excuse to explain the disappearance of 1.5 million Armenians. And Professor Gökçe talks about Arabized Armenians. Yes, I would like to use my time well, so I will just pass on it. Salim Georgi, Siirt, Hatay, Urfa, Mardin, and other regions are concerned here. Armenians living in these regions are now conceal themselves under Arabic identity and present themselves as Arabs. In the magazine Akçam, there are also data that are crypto-Armenians living in Turkey. For instance, in Urfa, in Siirt, in Adana, there are Armenians who live this way, crypto-Armenians. So there has always been information about crypto-Armenians in the Turkish press and the centers of research. Arabized Armenians also live in the Sassoon and Mush regions. The people of those provinces know that there are Armenians living in these regions, but who speak Arabic. On the other hand, after the genocide, in different Arab countries, Syria and Lebanon, from these different Arab countries, people returned to eastern Armenia. Usually these cases of return are dated to the 1930s. And this, of course, corresponds to certain Kurdish revolts. So one could probably reason in the following manner. Turkish governments, administrations, predicted that Arabized Armenians could be used against the Kurds as a factor of equilibrium. The Arabized Armenians living in Turkey, as opposed to the Arabized Armenians in Syria, have certain experiences and established relations with the Christian communities there. But these experiences really have not been perceived by Armenian circles. We have to look into all this. Thank you.
It's a long day. 5 minutes only for question.
Sorular için çok az vaktimiz var. Sadece
I have a question for Gayane Çobanyan.
Yeah.
Հայերենով բիտնեմ։ Ուրեմն ես կուզեի գիտնալ, եթե դուք վկայություններու հանդիպած եք, ես ամբաշտոն գերբող խոսակցություններու ընթացքին Սասնո շրջանի մեջ լա իսլամացված լա քրիստոնյա հայերու թորներու հետ լա սասուն լա աստեղ հանդիպած են որոշ վկայություններու որոշ չափով զուսպ հայբի պատճառներով որոնց համաձայն հայերը եղերնի ժամանակ բռնության եւ տաժանության ենթարկված են Սասնո շրջանի.
During the genocide, the Armenians were forcibly Arabized in the Sason region, and we know very little from the literature about this. I have a question. If you have witnessed such information, did we Armenians impose self-censure on ourselves? Because we have so many Armenian communities in Syria and Lebanon who speak Arabic. I'm asking you this because about 10 years ago I was confronted to this reality, but in that period nobody in Aleppo knew that thousands of Armenians were massacred in Syria. How can this be? And do you know anything about this? I'll be answering in Armenian. Thank you. Did I run into people who were massacred by Arabs? Yes, in Turkey, especially in the Sasun region. And that's why I said the question of the Arabs welcoming the Armenians is not always a happy story, because we've listened to very different stories from that part of the world. And that Armenians were subjected to very violent treatment. This was done by Arab-speaking groups from Turkey and also from Lebanon and Syria. But essentially, what I can say is those who went there were generally saved. They lost their identities. They were assimilated by the society they found themselves in, and there are such examples as well. Now, to come to the second question. If Armenians are in good relations with Arab countries in general, especially after the genocide, and since we have large diaspora groups there, and since there's no use in provoking those groups, I was wondering whether we neglected these issues and self-censored these issues. I know from British sources that there was an Armenian massacre carried out by Arabs in Aleppo. Please be brief, because we've already spent our 5 minutes. Yes, you're right. This is a policy. We have good relations with Arab countries. We have a diaspora there. And we don't want to look into those painful memories. And I also have information about the massacres of 1918, and we need to talk about this. We shouldn't silence ourselves for political reasons.
Please.
Լուսում եք իմա լուսում եք երկու օրորդ կան է
Evet. Yes, you're touching upon two different issues. One is the situation of Islamicized Armenians in Turkey, and the other in Arab countries. And the question is, one was forceful and the other was chosen. So the Islamicized Armenians in Arab countries will you please not make comments but just ask a question, says the chairperson. I have a question for Taner Akçam. We were subject to genocide physically during the Ottoman time, but also culturally during the Republic. Why isn't anybody saying anything about Kemalism? Because during the Republic as well, there were so many events, but you keep speaking of the Ottomans. But we know that the persecution continued with the 6-7 September events in 1956 and others. This is a question for Taner Akçam. Well, of course, you can speak of a process when you're talking about the genocide. And in the Republican period, the remaining Armenian communities were also in the 1920s chased away from Anatolia, and policies were developed for this. They were forced to go to Istanbul or to Syria. And of course, this is a process. This is how you need to look at it. You're right. And the Republican period can be said very easily to be the continuation of the Ottoman rule. This is not our subject matter for this conference. You know how Şükrü Kaya played a leading role in the organization of the Armenian genocide. He also played a very active role during the Republic for the evacuation of the Kurdish territories. So you can see this as a continuum. You need to inform the person speaking in the hall that if he doesn't use a microphone, we cannot translate. He needs to use a microphone. The reason why genocide is legally defined, and you said that your reference was the Holocaust, is this because the Jews for decades kept saying that they were victims par excellence, and that nobody had been victimized as they had been, and that this was considered as the unique genocide where they were the prime victims, and this is still being perpetuated through Hollywood films, etc. No, this is not the reason. It's got nothing to do with that. Lemkin, when he takes up this concept of genocide, did this after the 1921 trial of Talat Pasha in Berlin. He is a student of law in the Faculty of Law, and he has a debate with his professor. He says, one man killed 1 million people and nobody tried him. So he's talking about Talat Pasha. But a man killed one person and they're trying him. So the professor says, think of a farm. And in this farm, the farmer has hens. The farmer can do what he likes to the hens. You cannot interfere. According to the law, Talat Pasha owned the farm. He is at the head of the state, and the Armenians are the hen and the chicken. And Lemkin says, no, that's not possible. People are not hens. And so he begins to develop an idea. In 1933 in Madrid, there's an international law conference, and he comes up with a suggestion. He's not there, but he sends his suggestion. So the crimes of vandalism and barbary are concepts that he develops before he develops the concept of genocide. But then he's not successful in this, and he had also fled Poland, and since he's a legal person, he creates the word genocide. And in fact, the term Holocaust was not really impacted by this word genocide, and it is especially when Lemkin wanted to pass this word in the United Nations, he tries to avoid using the word Holocaust because he wants to describe genocide as a crime against humanity. Why did Holocaust come to the forefront afterwards as the genocide par excellence? Because the Jews were very active and very successful in their endeavor to make their ordeal known, and I really commend them on that. They spent so much money and effort and set up so many institutions that if they hadn't, we wouldn't have worked so hard now on genocide issues. There are more than 200 institutions now in the United States working on this, and they realize that they cannot restrain themselves to the issue of the Holocaust, and they need to go beyond. So they say Holocaust and genocide studies now. And I can give you so many examples. We have people saying we shouldn't use Holocaust and genocide, and we should say only genocide because it comprises everything, is what many scholars say now.
And it's about Anna's presentation. You were talking about the liberation of women from Muslim Islamic forces. While talking about these vulnerable issues like genocide and issues related to genocide, I think it's important not to victimize and pacify the people who are subjected to genocide and the assimilatory practices. And I find like representing women, displaying women as victims and children, of course, as victims problematic, like waiting to be rescued is a little bit an Orientalistic approach, I think. I find it a little bit problematic, and I think it's important to incorporate their experiences and voices into this literature. It's more important, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. I prefer to answer in Armenian if it's possible. Ուրեմն շնորհակալություն.
Thank you for the question. Indeed, the issue of Armenian women and children is something we talk a lot about because it was a very important mission to save them after the genocide, and many Armenians after this genocide did not want to re-become Armenians, but many of them, even if it was at a very painful price, wanted to keep their identity. And this is very important. They were able to survive, and they were able to survive because they remained within those families, but it does not mean that they survived. They were able to stay alive. These are two different things, and what I can say is that their experience should be studied much more in detail.